Okay, so we're going to finish up in this video. We're going to talk about how the middle class vote was a little bit more ambiguous in the 2012 election. And then we'll talk about that controversial Electoral College, and then we'll kind of wrap up with how we understand this whole chapter. And then, by all means, if you have questions about anything before you write an essay, you have two different ones to choose from: campaign finance reform and the Electoral College. Shoot me emails, anything like that. I know we're doing this chapter a little bit more independently, but I think I'm hoping that at least the Electoral College is pretty self-explanatory and that we covered campaign finance in class on Friday. Okay, so why was the middle class vote a little bit more confusing in the 2012 election? Well, part of it is because when you see little to no economic growth, it certainly makes it more difficult for the incumbent to hang on to his seat. Right? Most of the time we see the incumbent does have an advantage in a lot of ways. Of course, in terms of generating PAC money, they have more of an influence. We already talked about that. Basically, PACs feel like they have there's maybe more of a likelihood that the incumbent candidate is going to win, so they're more likely to invest in that campaign. But in 2012, we saw that the economy really only grew by about 1.8%. So Obama had to take a different strategy to convince the electorate to vote for him yet again. And so basically what he argued was that he did as best he could given the economic circumstances. So that the little economic growth was not really his fault. If anything, the people should be thankful about the fact that the economy did not shrink during his administration. And so what did Romney do to ultimately try to attract voters away from Obama? Well, like the quintessential Republican, he argued that he was going to reduce the scope of government. All right, he argued against Obama's controversial health care plan. And of course, if he argued that he would repeal the health care plan, this also would mean that that would take away a significant amount of the government's budget, since so much money goes towards health care. And he wanted to change the healthcare issue and leave it up to the states. So the people that were attracted to Mitt Romney were people that felt like the federal government was doing too much, spending too much. So how did Obama argue against him? Well, one of the things that he argued was that Romney was out of touch with the middle class, because Romney is very wealthy. All right, his policies, he argued, were more favorable towards the wealthy, and there were some voters that were convinced by what Obama said and started to believe that Obama really only cared for the rich voters. All right, you see that one of the jokes that is made about Mitt Romney a lot is he would make these comments that were actually indicating his wealth, but he had no idea what he was saying. So one of the most well-known ones was he was talking about how his wife drove a couple of Cadillacs and kind of talked about it like it was no big deal. And then, of course, you see this cartoon down here that also pokes at Obama's wealth and whether or not he's out of touch with reality. Okay, what did Obama again do to try to win middle-class voters? Well, he argued he was going to raise taxes on the wealthy. The middle class favors this, right? We saw 47% of the middle-class electorate favored this approach, and then 35% agreed with Romney's assertion that taxes should not go up at all. There were also some voters that favored Obama's immigration policy, foreign policy, and his stance on Medicare. Right? So Obama, basically what he did was he pledged to allow young immigrant graduates to obtain work permits. But Romney argued that kind of against this open immigration policy, and he thought that ultimately if there wasn't the proper work documentation granted to immigrants, that they would kind of naturally have to leave the country. So people who did not support opening up of immigration were in favor of what Romney had to say. So we got to talk about the Electoral College, which is something that is increasingly controversial as we look at certain elections that there is kind of much less of a discrepancy between two candidates in terms of the popular vote, but then the Electoral College is going to look a lot different. And, there are many people who argue against the Electoral College, so we have to think about why it still exists and whether or not there are arguments in favor of it. All right, so again, yeah, it's highly opposed by many people today. A lot of people argue that the Electoral College is not democratic. So why is that? Well, first off, there's obviously a possibility that a candidate can win the popular vote but lose the electoral vote. We most recently saw this in the 2000 election with Bush versus Gore. All right. Also, with the Electoral College, we might see that certain states matter way more than others. Really, with the Electoral College, candidates are pandering towards the swing or battleground states and not towards those solidly blue or solidly red states. That might mean that if you live in one of those states, like Connecticut, which is solidly blue, you may not really care as much, and you may feel like you're less invested in the election. You aren't actually going to see the election as very prominently positioned in the news. You might see the horse race, but you're not going to see as many advertisements because candidates don't want to spend money on states that have likely already been decided. You could also see that different types of governance could be distorted, right? Like in a swing state like Florida, you might see candidates talking much more about policies like Medicare, which may not affect other states that have a less considerable elderly population. You're also going to see maybe that candidates avoid certain issues when they are campaigning so as to make sure they don't kind of deter a certain state from voting for them. So a candidate might not want to talk about an issue like Cuba. We see Obama didn't start addressing Cuba until after the midterm elections because it might affect the turnout of a state like Florida. All right. So even though Obama wasn't running in 2014, if he started to open the door to Cuba before the election, it might have actually deterred more people for voting to vote for Democratic candidates. All right. Another thing that people argue makes the Electoral College controversial, something that they oppose, is that small states might be overrepresented. Excuse me. We're going to see that. So the Electoral College, to a certain extent, is meant to be proportional based on population, right? Like you see. States get delegates proportional to their population, but all states also get 2 bonus delegates for the number of senators they have. So of course, since we have the same senators in every state, a small state might actually have a few more electors than arguably they should if we're just basing it on population. Another thing that makes people oppose the Electoral College is you could have a tie, 269 to 269 electoral votes, which leaves the election up to the House, which could also mean that certain states would deadlock in that decision. Also, we see that with the Electoral College, it's virtually impossible for third parties to win elections. All right, so so why did people favor the Electoral College when it was initially developed? Well, some people thought that the final decision about a presidential election should go to a group of electors, which also goes along with the original limits to direct participation in government, right? We saw, for a certain period of time, there was indirect election of senators as well. So this was kind of a check on the potential dangers of leaving something as important as the presidential election entirely up to the people. All right. You're going to also see that basically. I already talked about some of the issues, I guess, with the Electoral College, so not to kind of belabor that point, but again, we see how the House could potentially have a significant role if no candidate receives the majority of electoral votes. However, this hasn't happened since the 1824 election, which was labeled the corrupt bargain, right? This was the one where Andrew Jackson argued that the election was given to John Quincy Adams because of Henry Clay. All right, so again, we're going to see less populated states have more representation, and battle states are key. All right, so so why do we still have the Electoral College? Some people argue that that it might bring more wisdom, again, kind of taking away from maybe the more precarious vote of the people. It preserves states' rights, so this is also something that people argue for in favor of the Electoral College. It ensures more attention to the less populous states, and it also produces clear winners, right? Because as we see here with the electoral vote, it's much, with the exception of this election, the 2000 election, we see that most of the time the winner is much more obvious than it would be with the popular vote. All right, last slide here. So understanding campaigns and voter behaviors. All right, so we have to ask the question, are nominations and elections democratic enough? And ultimately, are we going to see, do we see that democratic rate against other countries? Ultimately, we're going to see that other countries a lot of times have a much smaller elitist group selecting the nominees, whereas the people actually have a pretty significant role in the nomination game, right? And we saw that with the primaries in particular. And we also see this with the fact that the national convention is almost more symbolic. So, so things that we could maybe argue against the kind of our campaign and nomination process. First off, it's much longer because it's so open to the people, right? We're going to see also that there's less time between the election and the revving up of a new one. So, does this give politicians less time to actually govern, and are they constantly running? All right, so again, maybe making the nomination process more democratic might actually be detrimental. Right, also, the longer a campaign process is and a nomination process is, it's going to cost more. And again, it may discourage qualified candidates from running because they don't feel like they can take away their time from governing. All right, so do elections actually affect public policy? Well, we're going to see that that when there's a greater difference between two candidates, it is more likely to affect public policy. That partly might be due to the mandate theory. We're also going to see that when candidates are ambiguous about policy, there might be less of a likelihood that that you're going to have a significant change in policy due to elections. All right. Also, we want to see whether or not campaigns lead to increases in the scope of government. Right. Well, generally, we can make the argument that yes, the scope of government increases because of campaigns. Why? Because candidates have to, when they're campaigning, kind of tailor their promises and potential policies to different regions of the country. So, for example, if you're working, even if you're working within one state. So I think I mentioned Pennsylvania in class. Right? Pennsylvania has a significant urban population, and then a lot of the state is very rural. So if you're trying to gain Pennsylvania, you might be arguing for agricultural subsidies to pander towards the rural population, and then you might be arguing for more support in public works for cities or a greater transportation network, right? Which panders more towards, of course, the urban population. So this basically means you're going to have to enact more policies because you promised more in order to try to win the election. So that costs more money, increasing the scope of the government. All right. And also, because elections are really frequent, voters might feel like the government should be more responsive to their needs. Okay, so more of a demand from the government based on these frequent elections. Okay, so wrapping it all up. All right, again, the essay you will find on Jupiter. There's a question about campaign finance reform. I would say if you missed that class, you might not want to write that essay. So I'm looking at Batsheva there since she left a little bit early. So I might focus on the Electoral College. If you have questions about anything as you are writing, please feel free to send me an email. I should be checking it at least once a day over the break. And again, I wish you guys a really happy break, and I will see you in January.